Sometimes life puts us through paths of humiliation to prepare us for a greater destiny. In that modest home in Pittsburgh, I was invisible to everyone except myself, and that invisibility became my greatest strength. Hello, my dear ones. I'm Dorothy, but everyone calls me Dot. Today I'm 89 years old and my heart is full of stories to tell. Before I begin this story that completely changed my life, I want to ask you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's such a joy to know that my stories reach so many different places. I'm going to tell you today how I went from betrayal and heartbreak to building an empire when everything seemed lost. This story begins on a cold winter afternoon in Pittsburgh, 1968, when I was just 27 years old and thought I knew what my life would be. I had no idea that discovering my husband's betrayal would actually set me free. Let me take you back to that day that changed everything. It was February 15th, 1968, and the snow was falling thick outside our little house on Carson Street. I had left my job at the diner early because my youngest daughter Emma had come down with a fever. Frank, my husband of 8 years, was supposed to be at his restaurant, Richardson's Family Diner, just a few blocks away. We'd built that place together from nothing, or so I thought. Our 2 girls, Emma, who was 5, and Sarah, who was 7, were my whole world. Frank always said a woman's place was at home with the children, and I believed him. I believed everything he told me back then. I remember walking up those creaky wooden steps to our bedroom, carrying a cup of hot tea for myself, thinking about how I'd surprise Frank with his favorite pot roast when he came home. The house was quiet except for the girls playing downstairs and the sound of piano music coming from our front room. Mrs. Catherine Weber came every Tuesday and Thursday to give the girls their piano lessons. She was a refined woman in her early 30s, always dressed so elegantly, with her blonde hair perfectly styled. I admired her sophistication, wished I could carry myself the way she did. But when I reached the top of those stairs, my world shattered into a million pieces. Through the crack in our bedroom door, I saw my husband, Frank, in bed with Catherine. Not just talking, not just sitting close, but tangled together in sheets that I had washed and ironed with my own hands just that morning. The cup slipped from my fingers, but somehow I caught it before it crashed to the floor. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure they'd hear it, but they were too lost in each other to notice anything else. I stood there frozen, watching the man I'd loved since I was 19, the father of my children, betray everything we'd built together. Catherine's expensive perfume filled the air, mixing with the scent of Frank's cologne, creating this sickening sweetness that made my stomach turn. I wanted to scream, to burst through that door and tear them apart. But something held me back. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was the sound of my daughter's laughter floating up from downstairs. Or maybe it was some instinct telling me that acting rashly would only hurt me more. Instead, I backed away quietly, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor. I crept down to the kitchen and sat at our small formica table, the same one where Frank and I had planned our future over countless cups of coffee. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my teacup. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, listening to the sounds above me, trying to process what I'd just seen. When I finally heard footsteps on the stairs, I quickly busied myself at the stove, pretending to stir a pot of soup. Catherine came down first, her hair slightly mussed but her composure intact. She smiled at me with such warmth, such fake sincerity, that I wanted to slap her perfectly made-up face. "How's little Emma feeling?" she asked, adjusting her coat. "I hope she gets better soon. The girls are making such wonderful progress with their music." "She's doing much better, thank you," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. "Same time Thursday?" "Of course, Dorothy. I wouldn't miss it for the world." The way she said my name, with this little smile playing at her lips, made my skin crawl. She knew. She knew that I was just the naive little wife who stayed home and cooked and cleaned, while she took whatever she wanted from my life. Frank came down a few minutes later, whistling some tune, acting like nothing had happened. He kissed my cheek, the same cheek he'd kissed every day for 8 years, but now it felt like poison against my skin. "How's business today?" I asked, testing him, wondering if he'd lie to my face. "Oh, you know, same old thing. Lunch rush was crazy. Dinner's been slow. I might be late tonight, got some supplier meetings to handle." The lies rolled off his tongue so easily. I wondered how many times he'd practiced them. How many times had he used supplier meetings to cover up his afternoons with Catherine? That night, after the girls were asleep, I lay in bed next to Frank, staring at the ceiling and listening to him snore. The same man who'd held me when I cried over my mother's passing, who'd stayed up all night when the girls were sick, who'd promised to love me until death do us part. I felt like I was lying next to a stranger, someone wearing Frank's face but harboring secrets I'd never imagined. I started thinking about my grandmother's sewing machine, sitting unused in our basement. Grandma Rose had taught me to sew when I was just 6 years old, sitting on a little stool beside her as she worked magic with fabric and thread. "A woman who can sew will never go hungry," she used to tell me. "There's always someone who needs mending, always someone who needs something beautiful made." After Grandma passed, I'd packed away her machine and all her sewing supplies, thinking I'd never need them. Frank made enough money at the restaurant, or so I thought. I was a wife and mother now. I didn't need to work with my hands anymore. But lying there in the dark, listening to the wind howl outside our window, I began to think maybe Grandma Rose had been preparing me for something I never saw coming. The next morning, I sent the girls off to school and waited for Frank to leave for work. Then I went down to that musty basement and uncovered Grandma's old Singer sewing machine. It was a beautiful thing, black with gold scrollwork, heavy and solid. I plugged it in, and to my amazement, it hummed to life like it had been waiting for me all these years. I spent that morning going through my closet, looking at every dress, every skirt, every blouse with new eyes. I noticed how the hems on my clothes had gotten uneven, how some seams were pulling apart, how faded everything looked. When was the last time I'd bought myself something new? When was the last time I'd felt beautiful? I started with small things, mending the girls' clothes, taking in Frank's shirts that had gotten too big as he'd lost weight. He'd been losing weight, I realized. I'd attributed it to stress from the restaurant, but now I wondered if it was because he was trying to look good for Catherine. That afternoon, I was in the kitchen when Mrs. Henderson from next door knocked on my back door. She was holding a dress in her arms, a blue work uniform with a torn seam down the side. "Dorothy, honey, I know this is a lot to ask, but do you happen to know how to sew? I tore this at work today, and I can't afford to buy a new one. I heard your grandmother was quite the seamstress." I looked at that simple blue dress and saw opportunity knocking. "Of course, Mrs. Henderson. I'd be happy to fix it for you." "Oh, bless you, dear. How much would you charge?" Charge? I hadn't thought about charging money. But then I remembered the secret I was keeping, the need that was growing inside me like a seed in dark soil. $5? I said tentatively. $5. Honey, that's a bargain. I'd pay twice that at the tailor shop downtown. That was the moment everything changed. Mrs. Henderson's torn uniform became my first paying job, my first step toward independence. I didn't know it then, but that $5 repair job would eventually grow into something I could never have imagined. As I worked on that uniform that evening, carefully stitching the seam back together, making it stronger than it had been before, I thought about my own life. Maybe I was like that dress, torn and damaged, but not beyond repair. Maybe I could make myself stronger too. Frank came home late that night, smelling like cigarettes and perfume that wasn't mine. He kissed my forehead absently and mumbled something about inventory before heading straight to bed. I stayed up until midnight, finishing Mrs. Henderson's uniform by lamplight, and when I was done, I held it up and smiled. It looked perfect, better than new. I was learning that sometimes the most beautiful things come from taking something broken and making it whole again. The next few weeks passed in a strange routine. Frank would leave for work. I'd take care of the girls, and in my spare moments, I'd sew. Word spread quickly in our neighborhood about my skills. Mrs. Henderson told her sister, who told her co-worker, who told her friend. Soon I had a steady stream of mending jobs, and then people started asking if I could make things from scratch. I discovered I had a talent I'd never fully explored. My hands seemed to know exactly what to do with fabric, like they remembered every lesson Grandma Rose had taught me. I could look at a woman and envision exactly what style would flatter her figure, what colors would bring out her eyes. But the real revelation came when I was cleaning Frank's clothes one evening. In the pocket of his work pants, I found something that changed everything. It was a small bank book, not from our usual bank, but from First National downtown. I opened it with trembling fingers and nearly fainted at what I saw. Frank had been siphoning money from our restaurant for months, maybe years. Small amounts at first, $20 or $30 here and there. But recently, the withdrawals had gotten bigger. The current balance was over $3,000, more money than I'd ever seen in one place. But what made my blood run cold were the notations written in Frank's handwriting along the margins. C's apartment, first month's rent, train tickets, 2 adults, jewelry for C. My husband wasn't just cheating on me. He was planning to leave me and take our life savings with him. He was going to abandon me and the girls with nothing. Just disappear one day like we never mattered at all. I sat on our bedroom floor, holding that bank book, and felt something inside me harden like steel. The scared, hurt woman I'd been was still there, but she was being joined by someone stronger, someone who refused to be discarded like yesterday's newspaper. I carefully put the bank book back exactly where I'd found it, and went downstairs to my sewing machine. I had work to do, and not just the kind that involved fabric and thread. I was going to build something of my own, something Frank couldn't take away from me, and I was going to do it right under his nose. That night, I started planning my escape not with anger or revenge, but with the same careful precision I used when cutting fabric for a complicated pattern. Every step had to be perfect, every measurement exact, because I was only going to get one chance to do this right. The woman Frank thought he was leaving behind was about to disappear forever, but not in the way he expected. I started by doing something I'd never done before. I lied to my husband. When he asked about the extra income I was bringing in from sewing, I told him it was just $20 or $30 a week, pin money for household expenses. In reality, I was making almost $75 a week, and every penny went into a coffee can I hid behind Grandma's old sewing supplies in the basement. My big break came when Mrs. Patterson, who worked as a supervisor at the Hilton Hotel downtown, asked if I could make uniforms for the housekeeping staff. The hotel was expanding, and they needed 20 new uniforms in just 6 weeks. It was more work than I'd ever taken on, but the pay was incredible. $300 for the complete order. I worked like a woman possessed. After Frank left for work and the girls went to school, I'd rush down to the basement and sew until my fingers ached. I had to pick the girls up from school, make dinner, help with homework, and pretend everything was normal. Then sneak back downstairs after everyone was asleep. The strain was enormous. I was getting maybe 4 hours of sleep a night, surviving on coffee and determination. But every finished uniform brought me closer to freedom. I was careful to hide my work, storing the completed uniforms at Mrs. Patterson's house until the order was finished. Frank noticed I was tired, but he attributed it to taking care of the house and kids. "You should rest more, Dot," he'd say, while planning his escape with another woman. The irony wasn't lost on me. During this time, I also discovered that Catherine had been feeding Frank lies about me. I overheard a phone conversation where he was complaining to someone about how boring I'd become, how I never wanted to do anything exciting anymore. She'd convinced him that he deserved better, that he was too young to be tied down to a woman who'd let herself go. I looked at myself in the mirror that night and realized she was partly right. I had let myself go, but not in the way she meant. I'd let go of my dreams, my independence, my sense of self-worth. I'd become someone I didn't recognize, someone whose entire identity was wrapped up in being Frank's wife and the girl's mother. But I was about to let go of something else, the illusion that Frank Richardson had any power over my future. The hotel uniform project was completed right on schedule, and Mrs. Patterson was so impressed that she introduced me to other supervisors in the service industry. Soon I was making uniforms for restaurants, beauty salons, and medical offices all over Pittsburgh. My coffee can was overflowing, so I opened my own bank account at a different bank across town. I told the banker I was starting a small sewing business from home. When he asked about my husband's involvement, I smiled sweetly and said Frank was very supportive but preferred to focus on his restaurant while I handled the household income. It wasn't entirely a lie. By April of 1969, I had saved over $800, more money than I'd ever controlled in my life. But more importantly, I'd built a reputation. Women throughout the city were talking about Dorothy Richardson and her beautiful, affordable sewing work. I was booked solid through the summer. That's when I found the second piece of evidence that sealed Frank's fate. Hidden in his toolbox in the garage, I discovered a train schedule with dates circled in red ink and a note in Catherine's handwriting. Can't wait to start our new life in Chicago. Just 6 more weeks, my darling. 6 weeks. That's how much time I had to finalize my plans. I spent the next week scouting locations for a small shop. I found a perfect space on East Carson Street, just 4 blocks from our house, but in the opposite direction from Frank's restaurant. It was tiny, maybe 400 square feet, but it had good lighting and space for several sewing machines. The rent was $45 a month, which seemed terrifying and liberating at the same time. I told the landlord I'd give him an answer by the end of May. That gave me exactly the timeline I needed. The hardest part was keeping everything secret from the girls. Emma and Sarah knew something was different about Mommy, but they couldn't understand why I seemed sad and excited at the same time. I started preparing them gradually, talking about how sometimes families change, how sometimes mommies and daddies live in different houses, but still love their children just as much. Are you and Daddy getting divorced? Sarah asked me one evening as I braided her hair for bed. Would that scare you, sweetheart? She thought for a moment, then said, Mrs. Johnson got divorced and she seems happier now. And Jenny still sees her daddy every weekend. Children see things so clearly sometimes. Sarah had noticed that Mommy and Daddy barely talked anymore. That Daddy came home later and later. That the piano lessons had suddenly stopped after Catherine claimed she was taking a break from teaching. 3 weeks before Frank's planned departure, I made my move. I signed the lease on the shop, paid the first month's rent and security deposit, and arranged to have Grandma's sewing machine moved there, along with 2 additional machines I'd bought secondhand. I hired Mrs. Patterson's daughter, a 17-year-old named Julie, who was excellent with details, to help me during busy periods. I told the girls we were going to move to a new apartment, somewhere prettier and closer to their school. They were excited about the adventure, especially when I promised they could each have their own room and that we'd get a kitten. I spent my last week in that house on Carson Street, working around the clock to finish all my pending orders. Every dress, every uniform, every hemming job had to be completed because I was about to disappear from Frank's life, as completely as he planned to disappear from mine. The night before Frank's planned departure, I stayed up all night packing. Not everything, just what the girls and I would need to start over. I left behind the fancy dishes we'd received as wedding gifts, the furniture Frank had chosen, all the material reminders of our life together. I packed our clothes, the girls' toys, my sewing supplies, and my grandmother's jewelry. I also left behind a letter on Frank's pillow, written in my careful handwriting. Dear Frank, by the time you read this, the girls and I will be gone. I've known about Catherine for months, and I've known about the money you've been hiding. I hope Chicago brings you the happiness you think you deserve. The house is yours, along with all the dreams we used to share. The girls and I are starting fresh. Please don't try to find us. We won't be far, but we'll be free. Dorothy. At 6 in the morning on June 15th, 1969, exactly 1 year and 4 months after I discovered Frank's betrayal, I woke up Emma and Sarah and told them it was time for their adventure to begin. We left that house with 3 suitcases, my grandmother's sewing machine, and enough money to start over. Frank was still asleep, probably dreaming about his new life with Catherine. He had no idea that the woman he thought he was abandoning had already abandoned the life he represented. We moved into a small apartment above my new shop. It was cramped and noisy with traffic sounds from the street below and neighbors who played music too loud, but it was ours. For the first time in my adult life, I was responsible for my own future, and it was terrifying and wonderful at the same time. The first few months were harder than I'd expected. Running a business while raising 2 young girls as a single mother in 1969 was not something most women did. I faced skepticism from suppliers who didn't want to extend credit to a woman, customers who asked where my husband was, and landlords who wanted a man to co-sign my lease. But I also discovered a strength I never knew I possessed. When fabric suppliers tried to overcharge me, I found better sources. When customers questioned my prices, I showed them the quality of my work. When the girls got sick and I couldn't afford to lose work time, I taught them to help me with simple tasks like sorting buttons and organizing thread. Julie turned out to be a godsend. She had a natural eye for fashion and could handle basic alterations, which freed me up to focus on the more complicated custom work that brought in higher profits. Together, we slowly built a reputation for quality and reliability that spread throughout Pittsburgh's working women. By Christmas of 1969, I was breaking even financially, and the girls had adjusted to our new life. Emma had gotten the kitten I'd promised, a gray tabby she named Patches, and Sarah had joined the school choir. We were building something new together, something that belonged to us. That's when I got the phone call that would change everything again. Mrs. Richardson, this is Eleanor Whitman. I got your name from Patricia Patterson at the Hilton. I understand you do custom sewing work? Mrs. Whitman's voice had the refined accent of Pittsburgh's elite, the kind of woman who lived in Shadyside or Squirrel Hill and wore clothes that cost more than I used to make in 6 months. Yes, I do custom work. What did you have in mind? I need a complete wardrobe for my daughter's wedding, 6 bridesmaids' dresses, a mother of the bride dress for myself, and possibly the wedding dress if you're up to the challenge. The wedding is in April, and cost is not a primary concern. Quality is. I nearly dropped the phone. This was the kind of commission that could establish my reputation among Pittsburgh's wealthy families, the kind of work that could transform my little shop into something much bigger. I'd be very interested in discussing this with you, Mrs. Whitman. When would you like to meet? Are you available tomorrow afternoon? I could come to your shop if that's convenient. Absolutely. I'll see you at 2 o'clock. After I hung up, I looked around my small shop with new eyes. The space that had seemed so perfect 6 months ago suddenly felt inadequate. If I was going to serve clients like Eleanor Whitman, I needed to create an environment that would inspire confidence and justify premium prices. I spent that entire evening and most of the night reorganizing and decorating. I moved the sewing machines to the back room where clients wouldn't see the mechanical side of the business, and created a front area that looked more like an elegant boutique than a neighborhood seamstress shop. I hung my best work on display, arranged fabric samples by color and texture, and even bought fresh flowers for the front window. Mrs. Whitman arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, dressed in a wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly rent. She was a tall, elegant woman in her 50s, with silver hair perfectly styled and jewelry that sparkled even in the afternoon light. But what surprised me was how genuinely interested she was in my work. She examined every piece I showed her, asking detailed questions about construction techniques and fabric choices. She wasn't just looking for someone to follow her orders. She wanted a collaborator, someone who understood that clothing could be art. My daughter has very specific ideas about her wedding, Mrs. Whitman explained. She wants something elegant, but not traditional, sophisticated, but not stuffy. Most of the designers I've consulted either don't understand her vision or want to charge outrageous prices for mediocre work. I showed her some sketches I'd been working on, designs I'd created during slow evenings when my imagination ran free. Her eyes lit up as she flipped through the pages. "These are extraordinary, Dorothy. You have a real gift. Where did you study design?" "I didn't study anywhere formal, Mrs. Whitman. My grandmother taught me to sew when I was young, and I've been developing my own style ever since." She smiled at that. Sometimes the best artists are self-taught. They're not limited by what they're told. Is impossible. We spent 3 hours discussing her daughter's wedding, looking at fabrics, sketching modifications to my designs. By the time she left, I had the largest commission of my life, 7 custom dresses totaling over $1,200. But more than that, I had something I'd been craving without realizing it. Respect. Mrs. Whitman didn't see me as just a housewife who knew how to sew. She saw me as an artist, a professional, someone worthy of creating something beautiful for the most important day in her daughter's life. That night, after the girls were asleep, I sat at my kitchen table and cried. Not from sadness, but from a kind of overwhelming gratitude. 18 months ago, I'd been a woman whose husband was planning to abandon her. Now I was a businesswoman with my own shop, my own reputation, and my own future. I thought about Frank and wondered if he was happy in Chicago with Catherine. I hoped he was, not because I forgave him, but because his happiness meant he'd never look back and try to reclaim what he'd thrown away. I was building something he could never touch, something that was entirely mine. Working on the Whitman Wedding Commission was like attending a master class in high-end fashion. Yeah, Mrs. Whitman introduced me to fabric suppliers I'd never heard of, places that sold silks and laces imported from Europe. She brought me books about fashion history and magazines from New York that showed me what wealthy women were wearing in places far beyond Pittsburgh. Most importantly, she introduced me to her friends. Word spread quickly through Pittsburgh's social circles about the talented seamstress who could create custom pieces that rivaled anything from the expensive boutiques in New York or Philadelphia. By the time the Whitman wedding took place in April of 1970, I had a waiting list of clients that stretched through the end of the year. I had to hire 2 more seamstresses and rent additional space in the building next door. Julie had become my assistant manager, handling appointments and managing the growing complexity of our schedule. The girls, now 8 and 10, had learned to do their homework in the back room while I worked, and they'd become my unofficial quality control team, pointing out when something didn't look quite right. The wedding itself was like something from a fairy tale. The ceremony took place at Hines Chapel, with the reception at the Pittsburgh Athletic Association. All 7 dresses were perfect, and Mrs. Whitman made sure everyone knew who had created them. I received 5 new commission requests that evening alone. But the real transformation wasn't just in my business. It was in how I saw myself. I'd gone from being Frank Richardson's abandoned wife to being Dorothy Richardson, designer and entrepreneur. I walked differently, talked differently, thought differently. I discovered that I was capable of things I'd never imagined. The girls noticed the change too. Sarah, now in 5th grade, wrote a school essay about her mother that began, "My mom is an artist who makes beautiful clothes for rich ladies. She works harder than anyone I know. But she's happy now in a way she never used to be." Reading that essay, I realized that I'd given my daughters something more valuable than financial security. I'd shown them that a woman could create her own destiny, that being abandoned didn't mean being defeated. By 1971, I was ready to take the next big step. I found a beautiful space in Shadyside, Pittsburgh's most fashionable shopping district, and opened Dorothy's Custom Design. The new shop was everything I'd dreamed of. Elegant fitting rooms, display areas for my most beautiful pieces, and a workshop in the back where my team of 6 seamstresses could create magic with fabric and thread. The rent was terrifying, almost 10 times what I'd paid for my first little shop, but the clientele was worth it. I was now dressing the wives and daughters of Pittsburgh's steel barons, oil executives, and banking families. My clothes were appearing at charity galas, country club events, and society weddings throughout the region. I'd also started designing some ready-to-wear pieces, elegant dresses and suits that could be produced in small quantities and sold at premium prices. A boutique in Philadelphia had started carrying my work, and there was talk of expanding to New York. Emma and Sarah were thriving too. We'd moved to a beautiful apartment in Squirrel Hill, with big windows and enough space for each girl to have her own room, plus a home office where I could sketch and plan. They attended private school now, something I could never have afforded during my marriage to Frank. More importantly, they were growing up with a different understanding of what women could accomplish. They saw me making decisions, managing employees, handling money, traveling to fashion shows and trade events. They never questioned whether they could have careers of their own. They only wondered what kind of careers they wanted. I thought I'd put my past completely behind me, until the day in 1973, when everything came full circle in the most unexpected way. I was at my shop, reviewing fabric samples for a fall collection, when Julie knocked on my office door with an odd expression on her face. "Dorothy, there's someone here to see you. He says he's from the construction company working on our building expansion, but..." She paused, looking uncomfortable. "He asked specifically for Mrs. Dorothy Richardson. And when he said your name, he looked like he'd seen a ghost." I followed Julie to the front of the shop, and there, standing among the elegant dresses and luxurious fabrics, was Frank. He was wearing work clothes covered in plaster dust, his hair grayer than I remembered, his face weathered by hard work and disappointment. He looked like he'd aged 10 years in the force since I'd seen him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I was no longer the frightened, dependent woman he'd planned to abandon. I was wearing a suit I'd designed myself, standing in a shop that bore my name, surrounded by the evidence of everything I'd built from nothing. "Hello, Frank," I said finally, my voice steady and calm. "Julie, could you give us a few minutes alone?" After Julie left, Frank looked around the shop with undisguised amazement. This is really yours?" "Yes, it's really mine. All of it. I heard about you, you know. People talk about Dorothy Richardson, the designer, but I never thought it could be you. What happened to Chicago? What happened to Catherine?" His face crumpled slightly. "Catherine left me after 6 months. Turns out she was already married to someone else, some rich guy from Detroit. She'd been playing both of us. I lost everything, Dot. The restaurant, the house, all of it. I've been working construction jobs just to survive. I should have felt vindicated, should have enjoyed seeing him humbled and broken. But all I felt was a kind of distant pity. This man had once held my whole world in his hands, and now he was just a stranger who'd made some very poor choices. I'm sorry to hear that, Frank. That must have been very difficult. The girls. How are Emma and Sarah? Do they ever ask about me? They're wonderful. Emma's in high school now, wants to study business. Sarah's discovered she has a gift for music, plays violin in the youth symphony. They've built good lives for themselves. Do they hate me? I considered his question carefully. They don't hate you, Frank. But they don't need you either. They've learned to depend on themselves and each other. We stood there in silence for a moment. Two people who'd once shared everything and now shared nothing but history. Dot, I know I have no right to ask this, but I'm trying to get back on my feet. If you ever need any construction work, repairs, anything like that. I looked at this man who'd once thrown away everything we'd built together, who'd chosen passion over loyalty, excitement over stability. He was asking me for work, asking the woman he'd planned to abandon to give him a chance to rebuild his life. Actually, Frank, I do have some construction projects coming up. I'm opening a second location in Philadelphia next year, and there will be renovation work involved. If you're serious about getting back on your feet, I could use someone reliable. His eyes filled with tears. You'd do that? After everything I did to you? I'm not doing it for you, Frank. I'm doing it because I need good workers. And despite your poor judgment in personal matters, you always were good with your hands. And that was the truth. I wasn't offering him work out of forgiveness or sentiment. I was offering it because I'd learned to separate business from emotion, to make decisions based on practical considerations, rather than hurt feelings. Frank worked on my Philadelphia expansion, and later on a third location in Washington, D.C. He was professional, reliable, and kept our interactions strictly business. He never asked to see the girls, never tried to insert himself back into our lives. He seemed to understand that he'd forfeited those rights when he chose to walk away. Over the years, I'd see him occasionally at construction sites or renovation projects. We'd nod politely, discuss the work at hand, and go our separate ways. He'd found a new life, simpler and smaller than the one he'd thrown away, but apparently one that suited him better than the grand adventure he'd imagined with Catherine. By 1978, Dorothy's custom design had become one of the most successful fashion businesses in the region. I had shops in 3 cities, employed over 20 people, and my designs were being featured in national fashion magazines. I'd been profiled in Forbes as one of America's most successful female entrepreneurs, and I was invited to speak at business conferences about building a company from scratch. Emma had graduated from Carnegie Mellon with a business degree and joined my company as operations manager. Sarah had received a full scholarship to study music at Juilliard, but she spent her summers working in the shops, bringing her artistic sensibility to help with design decisions. I'd built more than a business. I'd built a legacy, something that would outlast me, something that my daughters could continue if they chose, or sell if they preferred to pursue their own dreams. Either way, they'd have choices I never had at their age, opportunities I never could have imagined. The greatest satisfaction wasn't the money or the recognition, though both were nice. It was the knowledge that I'd taken the worst thing that ever happened to me and transformed it into the best thing that ever happened to me. Frank's betrayal had set me free in ways I never could have anticipated. It forced me to discover strengths I didn't know I possessed, to take risks I never would have taken, to build something entirely my own. In 1983, 15 years after that terrible February afternoon, when I discovered my husband's infidelity, I received the ultimate validation. Vogue magazine featured my work in a 6-page spread titled American Dreams: How Dorothy Richardson Built a Fashion Empire from Heartbreak. The article told the whole story: the betrayal, the secret sewing, the escape, the gradual building of a business empire. It positioned me as an inspiration to women everywhere who'd been told they couldn't succeed on their own. But the real triumph wasn't the magazine spread or the national recognition. It was the quiet moment that evening when I sat in my beautiful office, looking out at the lights of Pittsburgh spread below me, knowing that every light represented possibilities, choices, dreams that could come true with enough determination and hard work. I thought about the woman I'd been 15 years earlier, so dependent on Frank's approval, so terrified of being alone, so convinced that her worth came from being someone's wife and mother. That woman couldn't have imagined the life I was living now. Frank had thought he was discarding me like an old dress that no longer suited him. Instead, he'd freed me to become someone I never could have been, while trying to be the woman he wanted. The betrayal that nearly destroyed me had actually been my salvation. And for that, in a strange way, I was almost grateful. Sometimes the most beautiful transformations come from the most painful beginnings. Sometimes being abandoned is really being set free. And sometimes the person who thinks they're throwing you away is actually giving you the greatest gift of your life, the chance to discover who you really are. Thank you so much for staying until the end. I hope my story touched your heart in some way. If you enjoyed it, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give this video a thumbs up. It really helps us reach more people who might need to hear these stories of resilience and hope. Every day we bring you new, inspiring stories about life, love, and overcoming challenges. So feel free to explore and find your favorite. And of course, we'd love to hear from you. What did you think of Dorothy's journey? Did her story inspire you in any way? Tell us in the comments below. We'll see you tomorrow with another incredible story.